Now the general discussion is open, and of course, the general discussion is about the three speakers, Professor Archer, Father Scannone, and Jeffrey Sachs. So I would like to collect your requests for the intervention. Mainly questions, okay? So Annette, yes, Stefano, Maggie, then Becchetti, Parbst, Ortiz is right, okay. This is the second one. Okay. On the other side, no. Okay, that's the first round. Professor Annette, please.
Thank you. I would just like to follow up on Jeff's talk, which I 110% agree with, of course. But I want to tie it into something that Professor Evers mentioned this morning when he mentioned identity politics, because I think there's an added dimension to this populist backlash too. There's the economic dimension, but there's also this cultural dimension that the left not only favors the professional classes over the working classes, but has adopted what's been called identity politics. And I just wanted to throw that open because I actually think that's a very contested term. And in my view, at least, it encompasses two separate things. On one side, it encompasses actually a core matter of justice, of racial justice, where groups are just being excluded from the common good. As Stefano would say, they're being zeroed out in their geometric mean. So that's a matter of justice. But there's another dimension which is not a matter of justice. It's really about the insistence on having autonomous desires affirmed and honored by society, which really comes from this libertarian ethos of the maximum extension of individual choices, which seems to have overtaken both the right and the left. So to me, it seems it's really, once again, in relation to the theme of this symposium, it's the colonization of all aspects of society by this libertarian market ideology. And I think, in my view, it's the chickens coming home to roost there too. So yes, it's the left favoring the professionals and ignoring the working class, but it's also this pervasive market ideology that is infecting aspects of society in ways that people just aren't even aware of.
Now, Umberto Ortiz, please.
Muchas gracias. Agradecer tanto al padre Scannone como a Víctor Chávez y al profesor Sachs. Tengo brevemente una pregunta a cada uno. El padre Scannone ha planteado una relación entre quienes podrían tener o tienen de hecho una postura inteligente con aquellos sectores que quizás tienen un aliento estratégico. ¿Cómo podría hacerse esa combinación, esa alianza? En tanto en cuanto lo estratégico estaría en el plano de estas experiencias que buscan proyectarse al bien común, mientras que lo inteligente sería quizás el bien particular. Pero ¿cómo podríamos conjugar estas situaciones? Igual también una pregunta similar a Víctor, que también nos ha planteado como estrategias, exigencias en el plano educativo, en el plano de la investigación, en el plano de la evangelización, y coloca también desafíos de cara a la evangelización. Francisco nos habla de una nueva evangelización. Entonces, ¿cuáles podrían ser esos desafíos de esta nueva evangelización? Recuerdo que en Perú hace unos años hubo un encuentro de religiones por la paz y se puso como uno de los problemas importantes un tema de lenguaje, que quizás desde las organizaciones basadas en la fe tenemos un lenguaje que no necesariamente dialoga con el lenguaje de la sociedad civil no creyente, por decirlo así. Sin embargo, hay, digamos, fines comunes. Entonces, ¿cómo podríamos encontrar esa confluencia de lenguajes? Y finalmente, para el profesor Sachs, muchas gracias por toda esta información, muy bien documentada y los desafíos. Mi pregunta sería, ¿cuál es la valoración que usted tiene del rol que está jugando la sociedad civil en los Estados Unidos en esta problemática?
Thank you. Stefano.
Thank you. I have a question for both Jeffrey and for Maggie. Let me start from Jeffrey. Don't you believe, Jeffrey, that trying to intervene on the redistribution today given the size of the picture you showed to us, is not enough. Today we are talking about certain people about pre-distribution. In other words, to intervene post factum when the income or in general the wealth has been generated via fiscal method perhaps is not enough. We have perhaps to intervene ex ante. Let me give you a concrete example. Take the case of this country, Italy. No, here we are not in Italy. We are in the Vatican State. Take the case of Italy. Why is it that the regions means provinces, of Italy, where there is a higher percentage of cooperative firms and social enterprises, ceteris paribus, with the same level of income, the Gini coefficient is much inferior than in other regions. What does it mean that? It means that the fact that we have to intervene on the composition. When Pope Francis talked about economic biodiversity, he means exactly, we have to operate in such a way that within the market sphere, different types of, because the presence of cooperatives is the best way to reduce inequality. Now, to Maggie, I would say, my question to you is the following. Why you said the heterodox economists are fond of real utopias and not of concrete utopias? I mean, prima facie, I would have supposed the opposite, that mainstream economists would be interested. Can you help me to understand in which sense heterodox are fond? Because that is bad news, bad piece of news. Because if non-mainstream economists are eager of real utopias, that is a bad sign. Second remark, don't you think that one of the reasons that you described in your robust analysis is due to the fact that so-called civil society organizations so far has been considered according to the additivistic approach and not to emergentistic approach? They are additive. Additive means they are, let's say, complement. If they are, okay, but we can do even without them. On the other hand, the major challenge today is to operate in such a way as this civil society organization become intriguing, compelling the other two spheres, the state and the market sphere, to change their relations. Finally, a word of clarification about competition, cooperation. You know, in the English language, there is only one word, competition. But in the Neo-Latin languages, such as French, Spanish, Italian, we have two words, which are competizione and concorrenza. And the point is that in English, there is no translation. Because now, competizione, competere, in Latin means moving in the same, jointly together in the same direction. Concorrenza means running together. But if we run together, only one wins. The other have to lose. But in the competitive game, in the sense of competere, many people can win. And that perhaps it's a way to clarify a concept that might be otherwise induce many people to misunderstand our dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Now, Maggie, you can ask questions. You will reply to Stefano at the end, okay? Because you have two roles. Okay.
Women are good at multitasking, you know that. The first one is, they're both to Geoffrey. For our first 10 minutes, we said almost exactly the same things with the same examples. My first question to you is about your picture of robotic automobile production. The question is very simple, but I've looked for data on this for the EU and the USA, and I can't find it. Namely, more workers have to be employed making the automated machinery. Can we find anywhere any estimate of whether those displaced routine workers are getting re-employed as robotics workers. And my second question is a statistic I did find, but don't understand and regard as very unjust, namely that if we differentiate, now these are British figures only, if we differentiate between victims of human trafficking and successful asylum seekers, then the asylum seekers are better off in terms of a multitude of benefits: cash, social services, educational rights, childcare, blah, blah, blah. It goes on. I found that curious because they are many times bigger as a cohort than trafficked people who gain conclusive grounds, reasons to remain. Because I would have thought logically from there, political parties, various, could actually gain political capital out of being very heavily against trafficking, which costs them less and strikes the moral high ground. But no, it's the other way around. They are more in support of the asylum seeker than the trafficked person, whether male, female, adult or child. I just don't understand.
Now, Leonardo Becchetti, please.
And the one is, you rightly say that migration is the most puzzling problem. In Italy, the same left party decided to put a cap on migrants because they said otherwise the social stability was not possible. So if you think that that's the only way we can do, the parallelism is perfect between Italy and the US. The only difference is that we don't have Trump, so far at least. And the second point is, don't you think that the problem is still before?
Italy gave us a role model for Trump, although
By the way,
our instance is a lot worse.
But yes, but a communication, don't you think that the problem is before in communication? So I think we need to devise an efficient communication strategy, because there are a lot of wrong messages. For example, you said rightly that tax redistribution can help low classes, while now the right went up with a flat tax or things like that. So I think that's another point. And the last point, don't you think that one issue could be fight against tax dodging or putting web taxes, not on robot, on the producer of wealth, and to use that for displaced workers?
Okay, thank you. Now, Adrian Pabst, please.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Margaret and then one to Geoffrey. I really enjoyed your critique of presentism and actualism as very sort of philosophically impoverished positions. I just wonder whether you agree with the following, that in some sense much of modern philosophy and political and economic thought sort of oscillates between a form of materialism and a form of transcendentalism, and whether precisely to avoid those two extremes we need a form of realism, as you've argued, but actually that realism also includes some notion of idealism. That is to say that the real is always disclosive of more than what we now see and what we now know. So in other words, that the actual is pregnant with all sorts of possibilities. And that in that sense, we are still very much following the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, who argued that actuality, comes before possibility. Because he was in some sense arguing that actuality is God. God is the active being, and in some sense everything is contained therein. Whereas if you start with logical possibility, you're sort of veering off into a form of transcendentalism, where you put logical possibility before the real world. And in that sense, you kind of get the ontological order wrong. So I'm just wondering whether you agree with that, or if you don't, why not in some sense? And then I was very interested in your presentation, Jeffrey, and the statistics and the trends are really frightening. I just wonder whether the response to the problems you've outlined so clearly do lie with things like multiculturalism and social mobility. Now, I'm not disputing that multiculturalism isn't true on a descriptive level. It clearly is. And I'm also not suggesting that all forms of social mobility are wrong. I'm just wondering whether social democracy doesn't have to do better than that in some sense, if it really wants to come to grips with today's problems and also win power back from, the populist right. Because it seems to me that with multiculturalism, what's still missing is a culture in which, we talk about bonds that bind us together. Multiculturalism very often is about ghettoization, segregation, a lack of any cultural bonds, and in other words, a lack of a sense of belonging. So I think multiculturalism descriptively, yes, but normatively, I wonder whether it's enough. And it seems to me it isn't. And so the left has to really abandon its form of identity politics and do much better talking about the common good, what it is to be a citizen, obligations and not just rights. And I think multiculturalism has been too much about the rights of individuals and groups and not enough about the obligations. And with social mobility, it seems to me that, it by definition involves winners and losers. And so if we just want to boost social mobility, we will still be dealing with a lot of economic losers, the so-called left behind. And I think just creating new safety nets won't address the root problem, which is how do we create an economy where everyone can make a contribution, where everyone can receive some reward, where everyone feels that they have a stake in the system. And so I think social mobility isn't enough, because ultimately it not only involves winners and losers, but it also buys into an idea of meritocracy, where only the best and the brightest win, and everyone else basically needs compensation because the market doesn't deal with their failures, as it were. And as Michael Young, who coined the phrase meritocracy, of course, remarked already in 1958, it's a very dangerous ideology, because ultimately it says there's one model of success, and if you don't conform to that, you're out. And I think the whole problem with liberal economics is that it's been saying for four decades there's only one model of success. And so I think we need to now think about vocation, talents, contribution, rather than simply boosting social mobility.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Adrian. Now, yeah.
We forgot completely what are the questions.
Okay.
With this incredible battery of questions.
I have got other two requests. Any more questions? No? I will give the word to the other two and then the replies, okay? Now, Professor Adalberti, please.
Yeah, okay. My kind of question, comment is asking ourselves, what take we from your message, or what take you from our message? Our message is here about bringing in a kind of third factor, to oversimplify it, the role of civil society. Your message, to cut it short or even to misunderstand it, would be, look at the Scandinavian countries, wherever we have a powerful social democratic state, things go better. Concerning this, I'd like to remind you to the very fact that if you look to the history of Scandinavia, it was a long history to build up public power. I would call it public power. And this public power rested on a complicated achievement, like in the Swedish concept of the people's home, of a basis which was laid in the area we work on here, which is the civil society, okay? So I think we shouldn't confuse the possibilities to create a public counter policy in a two-court vision that build up state action. That's a point, first point. And the second point, if we look to the history of the United States and to those, so to say, better days, we know that issues like public health, issues like urban decay, issues like long-term unemployment has always been successfully curbed by kind of, let's call it partnership action. Think about Johnson's program of the big society. Think about some important elements of the New Deal. It was always about building a special alliance of a strong regulating state force in sympathy and in some kind of partnership with social forces. So I think if we shouldn't, I think I don't want to be to mistake your message, but I think it's important that your message doesn't come wrongly out that we should have more votes to the left. No, it's not about voting. It's building a much more complicated issue of cooperation on which a counter against this vice, a kind of counterforce could be active.
Thank you, Adalbert. Last questions, Luigino Bruni.
Yes, I'm on my position just to confuse the audience. No, thank you very much for your presentations. Just a few, 2 points. One is a reaction and one is a short question. Now, first, I think this issue of competition and cooperation, as Professor Zamagni also mentioned, I think this dualistic way of approaching life, competition, cooperation, or eros, agape, gift and contract, I think is not very fertile usually when we try to understand the real society behavior. For instance, I think if we imagine a real market where there are people working together, cooperating, maybe you can imagine cooperation within organization, competition among companies. This is true, but it's also, you have also competition within organization, you have a cooperation with your competitors. I think collaboration is a mix of cooperation and competition together. I think sometimes it's too easy to imagine that the cooperation is good, the competition is bad, or maybe when cooperation starts, competition ends, and vice versa. I think the civil economy approach I claim for... okay, I finished.
Thank you, Luigino. Now, the replies by the 3 speakers. Shall we go in the same order? Okay. First, Maggie, and then Father Scannone, and third, Jeffrey. Please, Maggie. Yeah, if you agree. I mean, okay, you don't mind. Okay.
So the first question from Stefano was, why did I say I thought heterodox economists were fonder of real utopianism than concrete utopianism? Which is a good question because it's not completely obvious why they should be, except that most heterodox economists came out of mainstream economics as critics of it. Very, very few, if any, except some latter-day Marxists, were born as heterodox economists. So all of their training, all of their cultural capital, if you want to or must use that term, I don't like it, but anyway, everybody understands it, was vested in mainstream economics. Tony Lawson, professor of economics at Cambridge University, GB, argues that they had huge vested interests in metrification. And in fact, that a lot of their training was in advanced mathematics, that Tony himself, at the age of, I think, 66, was asked to teach differential calculus to grad school first years. There is a lot of sunk interests in metrics, and it's real utopianism that enables you to keep using your metrics, because, as I said in my talk, the main task of real utopianism is simply extrapolation. And nothing does this more easily than well-gathered metrics. So I don't find that a particular problem, especially if you add to it that there is, and has been, I think forever, a great suspicion of concrete or critical realist ontology as being metaphysical, as being something that could not be justified, whereas the empiricist, they keep their feet on the ground. Everybody can know what they are talking about. Nobody can deny that this is not real or unreal. In fact, much of it is unreal. Many of the extrapolations about our forthcoming well-being are completely unreal. Now, if I could run this in to Adrian's question, because I think the two are very closely related, and then just come back to the competitive congruencia question. Why am I so against extrapolation? Would be a good question. I think the answer is very simple. If you want to give yourself a nervous breakdown about the future of the world, just extrapolate from existing carbon emission data, and we are doomed. The answer is finitude. And Ramatamadan from the other Academy Pass and John Schellenhuber had some excellent data which you could really call is it too late data. Is it too late for the Paris Accord of no more than 2 degrees increase in carbon emissions to significantly postpone a climate change monumental crisis? By monumental, I mean something bigger and more horrendous than we have seen. And they were very uncertain about this. In other words, their message to the UN, to the whole Paris meeting, was really 2 degrees is setting the target too high. It should be lower than that, because it's not current emissions that actually count. It's the accumulation of emissions which can last in the atmosphere for, well, I read somewhere 100 years. John Schellenhuber said it could be 1,000 years. In other words, they do not automatically disperse. So, you know, if you just go in for extrapolation, you can end up thinking very negatively about everything. Now, on the real versus the transcendent that Adrian raised, realists are not scared of the word transcendence. They don't mean the same thing by it as religious people of any persuasion mean by it. What they simply mean is what needs to be the case for X phenomenon to occur. And with tongue-in-cheek, in 1979, Roy Bhaskar wrote in a book called The Possibility of Naturalism, what needs to be the case for Christmas shopping to take place. He meant it to be humorous. I mean, were atheists going to be trapped into saying the incarnation? No, they weren't. But we have no problem with that, and think that it actually leads to some better causal explanations than anything that can be provided by empiricism. But I'll leave that there because one could go on forever. So could I just finish by trying to answer Stefano's question? Yes, the words competitive and concurrencia. He is perfectly correct. We do not have concurrencia or concurrence in English, but we can readily translate them as run together. So I conceded to Pier Paolo that the Latin competere, there was nothing wrong with that as a practice if it was a collective practice that benefited the collectivities related and taking part in it. Now, concurrencia, run together. What do we mean? It depends where one's running and how one's running. Take Formula One racing, about which I know very little. Yes, car racing. Now, they run in teams of 2 from a motor manufacturer, right? There's a strategy in the relationship between number 1 and number 2. Number 2's job isn't, as in actually a recent outcome, it isn't to come in second. His job, her job, can be to block the path of a challenger to number 1 from whatever, what do you call it, motor manufacturer, from the Porsche stable, if you like. So that's a very nuanced kind of running together, a strategic, tactical one, in which somebody may well have to be run off the track in order to run others off the track to leave the field clear to number 1. So I'm not sure that our loss or absence of concurrencia, is much of a loss. Because I don't think, for example, firms in investment, big firms in investment banking play this sort of game, the Formula One game. They are in straightforward, normal, ordinary competition. And this is what leads to the dangerous, dishonest, sometimes disastrous Ponzi schemes and hedge fund manipulation, which may advance them ahead of another investment bank, but it doesn't do anybody else any good whatsoever. The rest are all losers in one way or another. So I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you, Maggie. Father Scannone, you received questions. Y si quiere...
Tengo la pregunta de Humberto Ortiz.
De Humberto Ortiz, sí.
Bueno, para responder voy a citar mis fuentes. Por un lado, un artículo en la carta de Aushall que escribió el padre Luis Ugalde, antiguo rector de la Universidad Andrés Bello de Caracas y presidente de la Aushall, la Asociación de las Universidades Jesuitas de América Latina. Él hacía referencia, que yo lo cité, pero como no se puede, no escribí las notas, tampoco el nombre de él lo di, a lo que pasó en Europa a fines del siglo XIX y comienzo del siglo XX, donde los que buscaban inteligentemente sus intereses se unieron con los sindicatos que trabajaban, digamos, y aún tuvieron que ganarse primero el derecho de huelga y luego a través de la huelga, etc. Y se dieron cuenta que era mejor una solución compartida que no el comunismo, con lo cual hubieran perdido todo, o huelga tras huelga, con lo cual sufrían sus intereses. Y entonces lograron una unión. Y por otro lado, yo recuerdo haber leído, pero después no lo encontré el texto, en Bernard Lonergan o en algún exégeta de Lonergan, puede ser en el padre Jerry Whelan, irlandés, profesor en la Gregoriana, o en Lonergan directamente o a través de Whelan, lo mismo pero dicho en general, es decir, la alianza de la multitud que buscan los intereses inteligentemente, y eso sobre todo recalcaba mucho Lonergan, con respecto y los que al contrario son de buena voluntad y se motivan por razones éticas y religiosas, etcétera, ¿no? Y no que esa masa se uniera con los que forman, digamos, un tipo de racionalidad de ganar a toda costa el máximo lucro, ¿no? Que normalmente son menos y son cada vez una minoría más fuerte, pero menos cantitativa. En países donde funciona, al menos formalmente, la democracia, decía, esa unión hace la fuerza, porque difícilmente los que realmente luchan por razones de gratuidad, de reciprocidad, de buena voluntad, etcétera, van a ser minoría, aunque sea una minoría calificada. Entonces, esas eran mis fuentes, y yo pienso que eso que se aplicaba, o se aplicó, y de hecho se puede determinar históricamente, en Europa de fines del siglo XIX y a la primera mitad del siglo XX, puede analógicamente aplicarse al mundo global. Porque yo recuerdo, hicimos en Tübingen con Peter Hühnermann un diálogo entre economistas, teólogos, filósofos, y visitamos distintas organizaciones de Alemania. Me acuerdo cuando visitamos los sindicatos, ellos nos decían, hemos tenido que renunciar a muchas de nuestros derechos que habíamos adquirido, porque dada la globalización no podemos competir. En ese momento, decían, con el sudeste asiático o con China, y si perdemos, pierde la empresa, perdemos todos, ¿no? Entonces, esa alianza me parece que es posible también a un nivel global. Luego, lo que tú decías del lenguaje, yo lo entendí más por el lado de lo religioso y evangélico. Yo creo que hay un lenguaje que todo el mundo entiende, que es como habla en gran parte, aunque no en toda la encíclica, pero en gran parte, por ejemplo, el Papa en Laudato Si. Cuando yo hablo de una conversión ecológica, de la casa común, o tomo otro lenguaje, por ejemplo, los derechos humanos, etcétera, son lenguajes, derechos y deberes humanos, son lenguajes que todo el mundo entiende. Aún los ateos, digamos, pueden entenderlo, no necesitan ni siquiera ser religiosos y mucho menos cristianos para entender. Entonces, ese tipo de lenguaje que une con lo filosófico, lo veo, por ejemplo, cuando Levinas va a hablar del rostro del otro, aunque está tomado de la Biblia, eso lo entienden todos. Y aunque sea un ateo, él después va a decir que dejó Dios su huella, pero antes de decir que Dios dejó su huella en el rostro del otro, ya hablar del rostro del otro, del pobre, del huérfano, de la viuda, es un lenguaje bíblico, pero lo puede entender aún aquel que no cree en la Biblia.
Gracias. Jeffrey, you have the last word and many questions to reply. Okay.
Thank you very much. First, let me say again in terms of remedies to the populism that even in the most successful egalitarian societies that we know, there is a lot of anti-politics. There's a lot of populist politics, anti-migrant politics in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Austria. These are not unsuccessful economies. These are the world's most successful economies. These are not unequal societies. So we should understand as a category that this is not an economic category in the sense of suffering or underclass or neglected. This is a sociological, interethnic issue. Many people want their country to be for their people. And I find, for example, the Danish People's Party to be an exemplar of that. It's a very, economically, it's a social democratic party, what I would regard as very progressive. And it is a social democratic party for Danish people. Please keep everyone else out. So that's a category that we need to understand and appreciate. It should be handled in its own right. It's true in Sweden, Denmark. It's obviously true in Austria, which is a very successful economy after all. And it just elected by a strong majority a young, highly anti-migrant prime minister. So the United States has both that and the social divisions. And it makes it even more polarized and more extreme because it is an economic populism in an odd kind of way, very perverse, but it is an economic reaction that voted in a plutocratic politician, but it's also this kind of social reaction. A lot of the questions made a very, very sound point that I want to agree with completely, the point you make. Social democracy did not come out of an economic textbook that said it would be good to have redistribution because the market leads to high inequalities. Social democracy came out of a social struggle, first of all, and a political struggle. And the Scandinavian social democracies are entirely in their history, or almost entirely, trade union movements first. And then the trade union movements became political parties, and the political parties became the welfare state. But alongside the welfare state remained strong trade unions. And this, I think, is quite notable. In Scandinavia today, the trade unions are still 2/3 of the workforce, even with all of the transformation to service economy and to all the rest. These remain highly unionized, and the unions play a significant role. In the United States, unionization peaked around 1950 at about 35% of the labor force. Union coverage now is about 9% of the labor force. We have no union movement to speak of. There still is the AFL-CIO, but it represents less than 1 out of 10 workers. It has no political, I wouldn't say no, it still is a vote, well, it's not even a vote bank for the Democrats. In fact, probably half or more of the members voted Republican this last election, or some significant fraction, but it is a on-the-ground workforce for the Democratic Party to an extent. Now, even though the grassroots members are not necessarily Democratic Party members. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have a union movement. There has never been a social democracy that has been achieved without a union movement that I know of. And the United States is as far from a social democracy as you could imagine of a high-income country. And though Bernie Sanders campaigned on a social democratic platform and excited young people who had never heard this before, and he was considered way out there, but of course what he was saying was completely mainstream social democratic politics of Western Europe. But from a US young point of view, it was thrilling to hear this language. And he came close, actually, to winning the nomination of the Democratic Party on that basis. So it's not impossible that this could take hold, but it is, it's difficult. When Franklin Roosevelt and introduced the New Deal, union militancy was surging, and he encouraged that surge. And by the time that John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson introduced the new frontier and the Great Society, unions were powerful still. They were a third of the labor force. They were a political and social and civil force. So that raises the question about civil society. And I have to say that for the United States, I don't know what it is. I don't know exactly if we have it and in what categories. We are so disconnected right now. We certainly don't have a trade union movement. We don't have a cooperative movement to speak of, almost not at all. Part of our civil society is gun lovers. They're maybe the most organized civil society group in the population and the most activated. I wrote a piece about such a limited proposal of some gun regulation this week, and of course got an outpouring of hate mail that I could not even read here without a silence box because it's so ugly. So that's one part of our civil society. Our racist skinheads are socially active right now, and they're in street confrontations with some kind of leftist groups. But our civil society is really weak. And this is, of course, what Robert Putnam has been writing about for decades. It's hard even to identify. Of course, people are on Facebook and they have thousands of friends that are not friends. We have sports aficionados, and we have race car aficionados, and we have reality TV aficionados, and we have World Wrestling Society aficionados. That's our civil society. Of course, we have some progressive groups and so on, but it's nothing like a base right now that you can identify as an operative political base. We have people who despise Trump. It's more than half the population, mind you, so the country is not completely crazy. And his approval rating is about 36% today, and his disapproval rating is about 58 or 59%. And people will go out to the streets to protest in favor of refugees or against Trump. But it's not really civil society in the way that is you might find from a cooperative movement or certainly a labor movement right now. Our workers have no organization. If you're in what is called the gig economy of Uber or other delivery services, you have absolutely no rights of any kind, and you really can't quite imagine them. So it raises very pertinent questions of what to do and on what sociological base to organize politics. I'm politically active not in a personal electoral sense, but in a political mobilization sense. And I generally view in a rather somewhat naive way that the issue is to help inform people of better options and to help encourage candidates to follow better options, but that's very much a political action, not a civil society action. It's not clear how you would mobilize people to the streets or even to the ballot box in a civil society manner in the United States in a short term, because it doesn't exist. I'm involved in an effort to try to bring some clear social goals to the American public for next year's election. Things like the right to paid leave, family leave, vacation time, because in the United States, there is no federal law that guarantees even 1 day of vacation time, not even 1 day of paid sick leave, not even 1 day of family leave. 0 at the federal level, and basically 0 at the state level for any worker rights. This doesn't mean that workers don't have those, but that's part of their contract, not part of their rights. So how to organize? Well, you could find a union here or there to have a street demonstration, but the unions are so weak that they're no route to political militancy or to political activation. And it's a bit of a mystery, I have to say, because we have become deracinated. Communities are very weak, highly mobile, highly diverse, not liking each other. The elites are definitely not mobilized because they're very comfortable, extremely comfortable. They're mobilized only to protect their low tax rates, but they're not mobilized for social purposes. So I take the point that a real healthy society depends on a civil society and a politics to match. We don't have that, so the question is on what sociological base to build it and how you would even communicate it exactly, and what is the right strategy, because we have very little to hold on to that I can see as the way to do this. Interestingly, by the way, on almost any question we ask, would you like to tax the rich more? Would you like to move to renewable energy? Is the problem of our politics special interests? Americans are roughly 2/3 to 1/3 on the right side of the answer, I would say. On guns, maybe, 50-50. But this is vested interest politics that we have and plutocratic politics that we have, so those public opinions don't really matter very much in terms of the actual decision-making in Congress. They don't matter for the voting very much. Making a link to between politics and voting is extremely difficult because getting attention is very hard. Trump ran a populist program. He is engineering, if he can succeed, a plutocratic program. It may not matter. So this is all to say that this is, even identifying what civil society is very, very difficult. On some of the specific questions, and I'll be brief, I know that I've gone on, are displaced workers getting re-employed to produce the robots? The answer is no, decisively no. The high-tech work is high-tech workers. The manufacturing employment has declined from 19 million to 12 million over the last 30 years, even as the labor force has increased by maybe 30% overall. So the workers that are displaced go to the low-wage service economy, and they end up in personal services, in the health sector, taking care of people, carrying things, very low wage, low protection, service economy. They lose rights if or bargaining power if they had it at all in the industrial sector. And what's going to happen, I believe, is that, as I mentioned, that the retail trade sector, which is a big employer of nearly around 20 million people in the United States, is going to go to e-commerce. So those jobs are about to disappear also, very fast. That's the Amazon.com phenomenon, and it's happening very, very fast now. And so this underlying pressure of people, even in a very rich country, average income $60,000 per person. The uncertainty, the vulnerability is very high. And the instability from that is very, very high. Communication strategy, I don't know what it is because it's hard to be heard in this. This is a very big question. And then finally on migration policy, on the question of sympathy for trafficked people, there's no sympathy. That's the starting point. Sympathy is not a politically active category right now. There's just no sympathy. No to refugees, no to help for poor people. At a political level, no sympathy. So it's hard to activate. We don't have any vote that is sympathetic right now on anything. It's just how horrendous the non-sympathetic is. That's what we're battling. Should we give $5 trillion of tax cuts for the rich or only $2 trillion for the rich? That's what we're battling right now. And then on the migration policy, there is a fundamental issue which needs to be faced, which is that the US and Europe, even for this divided society, but even more in Europe because it's not so divided, is highly attractive for billions of people in even worse circumstances. So if the door is just open to migration, it is literally the case that hundreds of millions of people would arrive in very short order. And if they knew that the door was going to be open for a very short period of time, they would pick up and rush to the airport if they could know that they'd get a work visa. It would be astounding how many people would leave. There are surveys. Would you go to the US or Europe if you could? It's hundreds of millions of people ready to move in a moment right now. So you cannot have open borders in our countries. It's not possible. Then the question is, what is possible? Canada has a policy which is probably the most generous, successful, open policy in the world. They aim for 1% of the population in net migration per year. And so far, Canadian society is held together as pro-migrant with that. So that, and how do they do it? They really are overtly multicultural. And they have so far succeeded in holding a consensus on this. But how this is going to really work is a very big question, and there is no big answer yet. And the left, if it says we should be open door and nice, will not win any more elections. So there has to be a standard that says realistically we can do X but not more. And so far, the left has not said that. The left has, because it seems painful to say. And the right is saying much worse. And so far, it's been almost no battle because the left cannot win elections on that basis.